April 7, 1945. The East China Sea. The battleship Yamato is on fire, the largest warship ever built. 72,000 tons of steel. 9 18-inch guns capable of hurling 3,200-pound shells 25 miles. A crew of 3,332 men. And right now, she is being torn apart by nearly 400 American aircraft circling above her like vultures over a dying animal. Torpedoes slam into her port side, one after another. She lists. Counterflooding fails. Her rudder jams. Men are thrown across decks, slick with blood and seawater. At 2:05 p.m., the order to abandon ship. At 2:23 p.m., Yamato rolls over and her magazines detonate. The explosion creates a mushroom cloud visible from 100 miles away. Of 3,332 men aboard, only 269 survive. But here is the detail that turns this tragedy into something far more disturbing. Something that transforms a naval battle into a forensic autopsy of an entire empire. The night before Yamato sailed, workers at the Tokuyama fuel depot received orders from the Naval General Staff. Fill the ship with just enough fuel for a one-way trip. There would be no return voyage. This was explicitly a suicide mission, but the workers at Tokuyama did something extraordinary. In secret defiance of those orders, they climbed down into the oil tanks and pumped out every last drop they could find. They filled Yamato to roughly 60% capacity, about 4,000 tons, instead of the bare minimum the orders specified. It was an act of compassion dressed as disobedience. These workers knew the crew was sailing to die. They could not stop the mission, but they could give those men the faintest, most impossible chance of turning around. It was not enough, and here is the part that should haunt you. Those 4,000 tons of fuel were essentially the last operational reserves of the Imperial Japanese Navy. After April 7, 1945, Japan had no fuel left to send any remaining ships to sea. The combined fleet ceased to exist, not because every ship had been sunk, but because every fuel tank was empty. Meanwhile, captured oil fields in Borneo were still producing. Oil sat in storage tanks thousands of miles away, with no tankers left to carry it home. How does a nation that launched the largest carrier strike force in history end up scraping the bottom of its fuel tanks 4 years later? How does an empire that seized some of the richest oil fields on Earth run out of gas? Today we are not looking at a battle. We are looking at the bill. This is the forensic audit of the most spectacular strategic miscalculation in modern military history. To understand why Yamato's crew sailed to their deaths on fumes, we need to go back to the moment the trap was set. It starts with a number, 50 million, and a clock that was already ticking. Part 1. The Clock and the Spy. Japan did not go to war because its leaders were irrational. Japan went to war because its leaders did the math, got the answer they wanted, and ignored every number that contradicted it. In 1941, Japan imported over 90% of its petroleum. Let that sink in for a moment. 9 out of every 10 barrels of fuel that kept Japan's warships at sea, its aircraft in the air, its factories running, came from somebody else's ground. That is not a vulnerability. That is a loaded gun pointed at your own head with someone else's finger on the trigger. For most of the 1930s, that someone else was the United States. American oil wells in California and Texas pumped the fuel that powered Japan's military machine. American tankers carried it across the Pacific. American companies sold it at market rates. It was an arrangement that worked perfectly, right up until Japan decided to conquer half of Asia. The dominoes fell fast. July 1937. Japan invades China. Full-scale war. Hundreds of thousands of troops, tanks, aircraft, artillery, all burning American fuel. Washington watched. Washington waited. September 1940. Japan signs the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Washington tightens export controls on scrap iron and steel. July 1941. Japan occupies southern French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, and that was the tripwire. On July 26, 1941, President Roosevelt signed an executive order freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. and imposing a full embargo on petroleum exports to Japan. Britain and the Dutch government in exile followed immediately. Overnight, Japan lost more than 80% of its oil supply. Now imagine you are an admiral in the Naval General Staff headquarters in Tokyo. You know Japan has approximately 50 million barrels in strategic reserves. Various historical estimates place this figure between 43 and 55 million barrels, but 50 million is the commonly cited number. Those reserves are spread between Navy stockpiles, Army stockpiles, and civilian reserves mandated by the Petroleum Industry Law of 1934. You also know that the Imperial Japanese Navy alone consumes approximately 2,900 barrels per hour during routine peacetime operations. That translates to roughly 69,600 barrels per day, over 25 million barrels per year, just for the Navy. Add the Army, add the war in China, add civilian needs. Japan was burning through its reserves at a rate that would exhaust them completely by sometime in 1943. The clock was ticking, and every admiral in that room could hear it. But before we get to the 3 calculations that sealed Japan's fate, I want you to meet someone. Because this story is not just about admirals and equations. It is about real people making decisions with consequences they could not begin to imagine. In March 1941, 4 months before the oil embargo, a slim 29-year-old man stepped off the Japanese liner Nita Maru at Pier 8 in Honolulu. His papers identified him as Tadashi Morimura, a junior diplomat assigned to the Japanese consulate. He received a lay greeting and was driven to the 2-story consulate on Nuanu Avenue. His real name was Takeo Yoshikawa, born March 7, 1912, in Ehime Prefecture. Ensign in the Imperial Japanese Navy, graduate of the Naval Academy at Etajima, class of 1933, where he finished 92nd out of 116 cadets. He had trained as a naval pilot, but a severe stomach ailment ended his flying career. Discharged in 1936, he briefly considered suicide. Then naval intelligence recruited him, and for the next 4 years, Yoshikawa became the acknowledged expert on the United States Navy, memorizing every warship by name, hull number, and technical specification. Now he was in Hawaii, and he was extraordinary at his job. Yoshikawa rented a 2nd-story apartment with a view of Pearl Harbor. He frequented a Japanese tea house called the Shunchoro on Alewa Heights that offered a panoramic view of the entire harbor and even kept a telescope for guests. He rented small airplanes at John Rogers Airport and flew over Oahu with a geisha as cover, calculating air turbulence patterns that would be critical for attacking pilots. He dressed as a laborer and took minibuses to the sugarcane fields at Aiuya, where he could observe submarine facilities below. He carried no camera. He made no notes during his outings. Everything was stored in his head, then encoded at the consulate and transmitted to Tokyo. One night in the fall of 1941, Yoshikawa stripped down and swam into the harbor, holding a large rock to stay submerged, breathing through a hollow reed rigged with a crude periscope camouflaged with driftwood. He was trying to observe anti-submarine barriers at the harbor entrance. He nearly drowned. He came away with nothing but scratches and a deep chill. Why am I telling you about Yoshikawa? Because he reported on something that would become the single most important detail in this entire story. 49 massive cylindrical fuel storage tanks sitting in 3 separate tank farms on the eastern shore of Pearl Harbor. Over 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil, all above ground, all visible from the air, all vulnerable to, as Admiral Chester Nimitz would later put it, 50 caliber bullets, let alone bombs. Remember that number, 4.5 million barrels. It is going to come back in a way nobody expected. The Americans knew Yoshikawa was suspicious. He was clearly too young for his diplomatic responsibilities. There was no Tadashi Morimura listed in the Japanese diplomatic register. They tailed him for months, but they never caught him doing anything they could prove. On September 24, 1941, Tokyo sent a message to the Honolulu consulate, actually addressed to Yoshikawa, that divided Pearl Harbor into 5 zones and requested the location and number of warships be indicated on a grid. American codebreakers intercepted the message. The purple diplomatic code had been broken. But due to staff shortages and other priorities, the message was not decrypted and distributed until mid-October, and then dismissed as routine consular reporting. That dismissal would cost 2,403 American lives. Yoshikawa's intelligence was used to plan the attack on Pearl Harbor, but it was used to plan an attack on battleships. Big, impressive, dramatic battleships that looked like the ultimate strategic prize, not the fuel tanks. Why? Because the men who planned Pearl Harbor were answering the wrong question. They asked, how do we cripple the American fleet? They should have asked, how do we buy enough time for our oil arithmetic to work? And that oil arithmetic was built on 3 assumptions. 3 calculations that seemed sound, seemed reasonable, seemed backed by every number the planners wanted to see. Every single one was catastrophically wrong, but to understand how wrong they were, we first need to understand who built them. And that brings us to one of the most unusual military officers who ever lived. A man who worked naked, survived on rice, and could recite the fuel capacity of every warship in 2 navies from memory. A man whose calculations would doom an empire. Part 2. The 3 fatal bets. Captain Kameto Kuroshima served as senior staff officer to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto aboard the flagship Nagato. Kuroshima was, by all accounts, one of the most intellectually brilliant officers in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was also one of the strangest. He sometimes locked himself in his cabin for days, working naked because he claimed clothes distracted him from strategic thinking. He chain-smoked constantly. His cabin was thick with incense. Orderlies called him Gandhi behind his back. Others used the less flattering nickname Boke Sambo, the foggy staff officer, because he often seemed to be in his own world. But when it came to logistics, fuel consumption, and operational mathematics, Kuroshima was razor-sharp, and the calculations he helped develop in 1941 would become the foundation of Japan's entire war strategy. The question facing the Naval General Staff was simple. Could Japan sustain a war against the United States? The answer depended entirely on oil, and the answer they produced was yes, if 3 assumptions hold true. The first assumption, the war would be short. Japanese leaders believed the United States would negotiate a settlement after 6 to 8 months of fighting. The logic seemed solid. Americans were accustomed to comfort. They were unwilling to accept heavy casualties far from home. After a series of devastating initial defeats, the shock would force Washington to the bargaining table. Japan would keep its conquests in Southeast Asia, and the Americans would go back to their comfortable lives. This assumption meant fuel consumption calculations only needed to cover a brief, intense campaign. Long-term sustainability was irrelevant. Why worry about fuel supplies in 1944 if the war would be over by mid-1942? Admiral Yamamoto himself had devastating doubts about this assumption. On January 7, 1941, before Pearl Harbor planning had begun in earnest, Yamamoto wrote a letter to Navy Minister Koshiro Oikawa. In that letter, he stated with absolute clarity that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. American industrial capacity was simply too vast. Think about the psychology of that moment. Yamamoto understood the mathematics. He knew the fuel numbers did not work long-term. He wrote it down on paper, and then he designed Pearl Harbor anyway, because the institutional pressures left no alternative. Expressing doubts in private letters was acceptable. Publicly refusing to plan the operation would have been career destruction. Someone less competent would have been appointed in his place, and the attack would have proceeded regardless. So the man who knew the math was wrong helped execute the plan built on that math. Remember that. It is the most important sentence in this entire story. The second assumption, Japanese naval operations would follow the decisive battle doctrine. Since the stunning victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905, Japanese naval strategy revolved around one concept, the decisive battle. The combined fleet would wait in home waters. The enemy fleet would steam westward. There would be 1 or 2 massive engagements where Japanese forces, fighting close to home, would annihilate the enemy in climactic surface actions. Under this model, most Japanese ships would spend most of their time at anchor, consuming minimal fuel. Only a small percentage of the fleet would be operating at any given moment. Fuel consumption would be low, predictable, manageable. What actually happened was the opposite of everything they predicted. The Pacific War became a continuous, grinding, fuel-devouring marathon stretching across millions of square miles of ocean. Carrier task forces raiding enemy bases thousands of miles from home, submarines on extended patrols, amphibious assaults on scattered islands requiring massive escort forces, destroyers constantly shuttling between bases, escorting convoys, hunting submarines. Let me make this concrete. A single Japanese destroyer cruising at 15 knots consumed roughly 100 tons of fuel oil per day. That same destroyer conducting combat operations at 25 to 30 knots burned 300 to 400 tons. Combat never happened at cruising speed. It happened at maximum speed. Fuel consumption during combat was 3 to 4 times higher than what peacetime planning assumed. Multiply that across dozens of destroyers. Add cruisers that burned even more. Add carriers running air operations. Add battleships consuming hundreds of tons daily, even at moderate speeds, and the actual consumption shattered every planning estimate. Japanese military consumption in fiscal year 1942 totaled approximately 41.8 million barrels. The planners had estimated 35 to 40 million. Actual consumption hit the ceiling of their most optimistic projection during a year when major operations were still ramping up. Fiscal year 1943 reached nearly 44 million barrels. The war was burning fuel at a rate the planners never imagined because they planned for a war that never materialized. Now, the third assumption. This was the one they bet the empire on. The one that seemed most bulletproof. The one that turned out to be the most catastrophically wrong. Capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields would solve the supply problem permanently. Before the war, the oil fields in Borneo, Sumatra, and Java produced approximately 65 million barrels per year. Japanese planners estimated military consumption at 35 to 40 million barrels annually. Simple math: capture those fields, and Japan would have more than enough oil to fight indefinitely. 65 million barrels of production against 40 million barrels of consumption. A comfortable surplus. The numbers worked beautifully, except they ignored two things that would destroy the entire equation: sabotage and submarines. And the story of what happened when Japanese forces actually reached those oil fields is one of the most dramatic and least told episodes of the entire Pacific War. Picture this: January 1942, the island of Tarakan, off the northeast coast of Borneo, one of the richest oil-producing areas in Southeast Asia, with 700 active oil wells. Lieutenant Colonel Simon de Waal, commander of the Dutch garrison, knows the Japanese invasion fleet is approaching. He has perhaps 1,100 troops against a full Japanese combined arms force. There is no possibility of holding the island. De Waal has one weapon left: destruction. On January 10th, he orders the demolition of every oil installation on Tarakan. Engineer platoons dynamite drilling pipes, triggering underground explosions that seal the wells permanently. Storage tanks are ruptured. By 10 p.m., 100,000 tons of oil are engulfed in flames. The Japanese invasion force lands the following morning under the silhouette of blazing oil fields, lighting up the night sky. Remember this detail: after the Dutch surrendered on Tarakan, Japanese forces executed the captured prisoners of war in retaliation for the sabotage. 72 Dutch POWs and 2 Dutch civilians were later massacred at Balikpapan for the same reason. The Japanese were that furious about the destruction, and that desperate for the oil. At Balikpapan itself, the second largest refining center in the Dutch East Indies after Palembang, Dutch engineers repeated the demolition on January 18th before Japanese forces arrived. Pumping stations dynamited, refineries wrecked, wells set ablaze with fires that burned for weeks. Concrete poured down drill holes, critical refinery components removed and thrown into rivers or buried in the jungle. Across the Dutch East Indies, the same pattern repeated. Allied defenders destroyed everything they could before retreating. The sabotage was not complete. Japanese forces moved fast enough to capture some facilities relatively intact, but overall damage was devastating. The result? In 1940, the Dutch East Indies produced 65 million barrels. In 1942, under Japanese occupation, production reached only 25.9 million barrels, less than 40% of pre-war output. The 65 million barrels that Japanese planners had built their entire war strategy around simply did not exist. And then something happened that made the shortfall even worse. On May 8, 1942, the American submarine USS Grenadier torpedoed the transport ship Taiyo Maru, 80 nautical miles from Mishima Lighthouse. The ship sank, killing 817 of the 1,044 people aboard. Among the dead were a large number of oil field technicians being transported to Borneo and Sumatra to restore the sabotaged facilities. Their loss delayed production recovery by months. The mathematics of oil were being rewritten in real time, and every revision made the numbers worse. By 1943, Japanese engineers managed to restore production to 49.6 million barrels, roughly 76% of pre-war levels. A genuinely impressive achievement, but by then it was too late. Because even with 49 million barrels sitting in storage tanks in Borneo, there was a new problem. A problem the planners had catastrophically underestimated: getting the oil home. And the force that would make that impossible was already waiting in the dark waters between Borneo and Japan, a force that would sink more Japanese shipping than any fleet action in history. But first, let me ask you something. Do you know the most dangerous job in the Japanese military during World War II? It was not flying a Zero. It was not charging an American beach. It was sailing on a tanker. And what happened to those tanker crews is one of the most devastating stories of the entire war. Part 3. The Underwater Stranglehold. If you had to pick the single most decisive factor in the collapse of the Japanese war machine, it would not be Midway. It would not be the island-hopping campaign. It would not even be the atomic bombs. It would be something far less dramatic, something that happened quietly, beneath the surface, in the dark waters between Borneo and Japan. The American submarine campaign against Japanese shipping was one of the most lethally effective military operations in history, and almost nobody talks about it. Here are the numbers. United States Navy submarines sank approximately 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, totaling nearly 5 million tons. They accounted for 56% of all Japanese merchant marine losses. They also sank roughly 200 warships. But the real story is not in the total tonnage. The real story is in the tankers. Japan's entire war strategy depended on transporting captured oil from Southeast Asia back to the home islands. That oil had to travel approximately 2,000 nautical miles from Borneo to Japan by tanker, through waters that American submarines were methodically turning into killing grounds. In December 1941, Japan possessed approximately 49 ocean-going tankers suitable for long-range oil transport. 49 ships for an empire fighting a war across the entire Pacific. It was barely sufficient for peacetime operations. For wartime, it was a disaster waiting to unfold. Each tanker could carry roughly 75,000 barrels of oil. The round trip from Borneo to Japan took approximately 4 weeks at economical speed. One tanker could theoretically deliver about 975,000 barrels per year, running continuously. To transport 49 million barrels, the amount produced in captured territories in 1943, Japan needed roughly 50 tankers in constant operation dedicated solely to Dutch East Indies shipments. That did not include tankers for naval operations, for moving oil between domestic ports, or for the ships inevitably being repaired, damaged, or sunk, and the submarines were sinking them faster than Japan could build replacements. Let me introduce you to Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton. He took command of USS Wahoo in late 1942, and he changed American submarine warfare forever. Before Morton, many submarine captains were cautious, trained in peacetime doctrine that treated submarines as fleet scouts rather than commerce raiders. Morton showed what an aggressive, fearless commander could accomplish. In January 1943, on his first patrol as skipper, he took Wahoo into the shallow, mine-infested waters of Wewak Harbor in New Guinea and destroyed an entire Japanese convoy. Morton's executive officer was a young lieutenant commander named Richard O'Kane, who watched and learned. Remember that name. Morton was killed in October 1943 when Wahoo was destroyed by Japanese forces in the waters off Hokkaido. The loss stunned the submarine community, but Morton's legacy was already secured in the tactics he pioneered and the men he trained. O'Kane went on to command USS Tang. Over 9 months in 1944, he sank a confirmed 24 enemy ships. One vessel destroyed for every 10 days on patrol. The most prolific submarine skipper of the entire war. But the truly devastating weapon was not any single submarine. It was intelligence. In early 1943, American cryptanalysts broke what submariners called the Maru Code, the Japanese cryptographic system used to route merchant ships through Empire waters. Suddenly, American submarines did not have to guess where the tankers were. They knew the daily noon position of every convoy. They knew the routes, the schedules, the destinations. A submarine captain could intercept a convoy on its plotted course, shadow the ships, and set up the ideal attack. The Luzon Strait, between the Philippines and Formosa, became the deadliest stretch of water in the Pacific. Every tanker traveling from Borneo to Japan had to pass through it. American submarines waited there like wolves at the mouth of a canyon. The cascade effects went far beyond simple tonnage losses. Each tanker sunk forced surviving ships to make more trips. More trips meant more time at sea. More time at sea meant more exposure to submarine attack. It was a death spiral where every loss increased the probability of the next loss. Tanker captains began taking circuitous routes to avoid known submarine patrol areas. Voyages that should have taken 4 weeks stretched to 5 or 6 as ships zigzagged, hugged coastlines, waited for escorts. Longer voyages meant fewer trips per year. Fewer trips meant less oil delivered, even by the tankers that survived. The psychological toll was devastating. Sailing on a Japanese tanker became one of the most dangerous jobs in any military service. Tankers were slow, poorly armed, often sailing without adequate escorts because destroyers were needed for combat operations elsewhere. Crews knew they were priority targets. They knew the Americans were listening to their communications. They knew submarines were waiting in the darkness ahead. Of the approximately 16,000 Americans who served on submarine patrols during the war, roughly 3,500 never returned, a casualty rate of 22%, the highest of any branch of the American military. The submariners paid a steep price for their victories, but the price Japan paid was the war itself. By late 1942, the tanker shortage had become critical. Oil sat in storage tanks in Borneo and Sumatra, with no ships available to move it. The submarine campaign had created a transportation choke point that strangled Japan's fuel supply more effectively than any embargo ever could. And here is the bitter irony that should make you sit back and think. Japan went to war specifically to break free from dependence on foreign oil. Japan captured the oil fields. Japan restored much of the production capacity, and then Japan could not get the oil home. The empire that conquered the Dutch East Indies to secure its fuel supply ended up watching that fuel sit unused in tropical storage tanks, while its fleet ran dry. The structural deficit was merciless. Japan needed approximately 40 million barrels of oil per year to sustain military operations at the intensity required to fight the United States. After accounting for submarine losses and transportation inefficiencies, Japan could import at most 20 to 25 million barrels per year from captured territories. Domestic production added roughly 3 million barrels. Synthetic fuel contributed negligible amounts, a gap of 12 to 17 million barrels per year. No combination of efficiency measures, conservation programs, or technical workarounds could close a deficit that large. By mid-1943, Japanese oil reserves had dropped to approximately 15 million barrels. The crisis threshold the Navy itself had identified, 10 million barrels, was approaching fast. Now, the Japanese leadership understood they were drowning. They could see the numbers on paper. They knew what the submarines were doing to their tanker fleet. And the solutions they attempted next revealed just how desperate things had become. Because when a nation starts burning unrefined crude oil in its warships and stationing its fleet thousands of miles from where the battles are being fought, that is not strategy. That is a patient on life support. And the machine is running out of power. Part 4. The price of empty tanks. When you are losing a war of logistics, you have two choices: change the logistics or change the war. Japan tried both. Neither worked. And the attempts themselves tell a story more damning than any defeat in battle. The first desperate measure was to move the fleet to the fuel. By late 1942, Japan began basing major warships at Singapore and in the waters around Borneo. Ships near the oil fields could refuel directly, eliminating the need for tanker transport to Japan. The logic was sound. The consequences were catastrophic. The decisive battles of the Pacific War were happening in the Central Pacific. Midway, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Marianas. These engagements were being fought 2,000 to 3,000 miles from Singapore. The ships that were supposed to defend Japan's perimeter were sitting near Borneo because that was where the fuel was. Think about what that means. Japan had built the mightiest battleships in history, Yamato and Musashi, each over 72,000 tons displacement. And for much of the war, they sat at anchor because sailing them consumed too much irreplaceable fuel. The most powerful warships on Earth, rendered useless by empty fuel gauges. The second measure was even more revealing. Japanese warships began burning unrefined crude oil, pumped directly from Borneo's wells. This saved tanker capacity because crude could be loaded at the source without refining. But crude oil contains sulfur, salt, sediment, and contaminants that refined bunker fuel has removed. The results were predictable and ugly. Boiler tubes clogged rapidly, heat transfer degraded. Maintenance schedules that normally called for cleaning every few months had to be compressed to every few weeks. Some ships suffered complete boiler failures and had to be towed to repair facilities. You are destroying your own fleet from the inside out, not from enemy shells, but from the garbage in your own fuel supply. And you are doing it because you have no alternative. The third measure was operational starvation. Cut training flights. Cancel naval exercises. Keep ships in port unless absolutely necessary. Conserve every barrel. But every week of reduced operations was a week the Americans used to build more ships, train more pilots, and advance closer to Japan. The Americans were not conserving. They were producing at full capacity. Their shipyards launched new vessels faster than Japan could repair damaged ones. Their oil fields pumped more in a month than Japan's entire strategic reserve. The asymmetry was staggering. Now let me show you what empty fuel tanks looked like in actual combat. June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the greatest carrier engagement in history. Japan sent 9 carriers against 15 American carriers. On paper, Japan still fielded a formidable naval air force. In reality, the fuel crisis had gutted its capability in ways no order of battle chart could capture. The veteran pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who had swept through Southeast Asia, who had dueled over Midway, were dead, killed in 3 years of attrition. Their replacements had received minimal training because training flights consumed fuel Japan did not have. American pilots had hundreds of hours in the cockpit. Some Japanese replacement pilots had fewer than 50. The result was what American airmen called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost approximately 550 aircraft in 2 days. 3 carriers sunk, naval aviation effectively destroyed as a fighting force, and the carriers themselves had operated at the extreme limit of their fuel range. They could not maneuver freely because every unnecessary mile consumed irreplaceable fuel. American carriers, supported by a massive logistics train of fleet oilers, had complete operational freedom. They could go anywhere, stay as long as they wanted, fight at maximum tempo. The difference was not skill, it was not courage, it was arithmetic. 4 months later, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, desperation reached its peak. Japan committed virtually its entire remaining surface fleet in a complex 3-pronged attack designed to destroy the American invasion force in the Philippines. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, built around the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, sailed from Brunei Bay in Borneo. The fleet departed with bunkers topped off from local crude oil. Musashi was sunk by American aircraft in the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th, taking over 1,000 men down with her. The operation consumed most of Japan's remaining fuel. Ships that survived could barely limp back to port. The fleet was effectively immobilized by fuel exhaustion. And there is one detail from later Gulf that captures the fuel crisis more vividly than any statistic. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force, built around 4 aircraft carriers, was deliberately used as a decoy. Its mission was to lure the American carrier fleet away from the invasion beaches so Kurita's battleships could attack the transports. The carriers were almost empty of aircraft. Japan could not put enough planes or trained pilots aboard to make them function as actual carriers, so instead they were sent out as bait, sacrificial decoys, floating targets designed to absorb American attention and American bombs, while the real attack came from a different direction. Using aircraft carriers as decoys, that is what happens when your pilot training program runs out of fuel. Ozawa succeeded in drawing Admiral Halsey's fleet north. All 4 carriers were sunk, but Kurita, at the critical moment, turned his fleet around and withdrew instead of pressing the attack on the vulnerable American transports. The reasons are debated to this day, but fuel considerations almost certainly played a role. Kurita knew that extended combat operations would leave his ships stranded without enough fuel to return home. The opportunity was gone, and so was the Navy. By late 1944, Japanese oil imports had collapsed almost completely. Most tankers had been sunk. The few that survived could barely operate. Ships sat at anchor with empty bunkers, unable to sortie even when ordered. The arithmetic that Yamamoto had warned about in January 1941 had finally, completely, inescapably caught up with reality. And that brings us to the final act, the one that started this story. The act that demonstrates, more clearly than any other moment in the Pacific War, what happens when a nation burns through the last of its fuel and the last of its options. Part 5 plus verdict. The last drop and the final bill. April 1945. Allied forces have invaded Okinawa, 350 miles from the Japanese mainland. Emperor Hirohito, briefed on the army's defense plans, asks the question that pierces through every layer of propaganda and institutional denial. But what about the Navy? What are they doing to assist in defending Okinawa? Have we no more ships? The answer cuts to the bone. The Imperial Japanese Navy still possesses ships. What it does not possess is fuel. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, conceives Operation Tengo, literally Operation Heaven. The plan is explicitly a suicide mission. Yamato and 9 escort ships will sail to Okinawa, fight through the American fleet, beach themselves on the shore, and serve as stationary gun platforms until destroyed. Surviving crew will go ashore and fight as infantry. When Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, who will command the mission at sea, presents the plan to his captains, they unanimously reject it. A waste of lives and resources. No possibility of success against overwhelming American air superiority. Then Vice Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka arrives from headquarters and explains that the Emperor expects the Navy to make its best effort. The captains accept. Crews are told the nature of the mission and given the chance to stay behind. Not one man volunteers to leave. 67 naval cadets from Etajima, class number 74, who had arrived on Yamato just 3 days earlier, are ordered off the ship. They are too young, too new. Roughly 80 other crew members who are ill or infirm are also removed. On the evening of April 5th, Yamato's executive officer organizes a farewell party for the crew. Many officers and sailors drink heavily. It is the night before a voyage from which none of them expect to return. At midnight, fueling begins. And here is where the story comes full circle. The Naval General Staff ordered Tokuyama to provide only enough fuel for a one-way trip. But the workers at the fuel depot defied those orders. They pumped out everything they could find, reportedly climbing down into the tanks to extract the last residual amounts. Yamato received approximately 4,000 tons, roughly 60% of her total capacity, rather than the bare minimum specified. Multiple historical accounts confirm this act of quiet rebellion. The fuel depot personnel could not stop the mission. They could not save those 3,332 men from what was coming, but they could give them more fuel than headquarters authorized. A small human gesture in the face of institutional madness. At 4 p.m. on April 6, 1945, Yamato, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers departed Tokuyama. 2 American submarines, Threadfin and Hackleback, spotted the Japanese force almost immediately as it entered the Bungo Strait between Shikoku and Kyushu. They shadowed the ships for hours, transmitting position updates to the American fleet. The messages were reportedly sent uncoded. Japanese radio operators on the ships intercepted them. The crew of Yamato knew the Americans were tracking them. They knew what was coming. That night, Admiral Spruance received the intelligence reports. He ordered his battleships to prepare for a surface engagement. Task Force 58 Commander Admiral Mark Mitcher had a different idea. He ordered his carrier groups to launch strike aircraft at 10 o'clock the following morning. Nearly 400 Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers were armed and readied. At dawn on April 7th, the Japanese force cleared the Osumi Peninsula and entered open ocean, heading south toward Okinawa. They shifted into defensive formation, Yahagi leading, Yamato in the center, destroyers deployed in a ring at 1,500-meter intervals. Headquarters had promised 9 Zero fighters as air cover between 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock a.m. It is unclear how many actually arrived. By any accounting, it was woefully inadequate against what was coming. At noon, the first American aircraft appeared. The attacks came in waves, coordinated, relentless, overwhelming. Dive bombers screaming down from above, torpedo planes boring in at wave-top height from multiple directions simultaneously. Yahagi took 13 bombs and 7 torpedoes before Captain Tamechi Hara counted the hits, turned to Rear Admiral Keizo Komura, and heard him say simply, "Let us go." They removed their shoes and jumped into the sea. Yahagi went down, creating a whirlpool that dragged Hara underwater for several terrifying minutes before he clawed his way back to the surface. 4 destroyers were sunk. The remaining 4, battered and burning, would eventually limp home. Yamato absorbed hit after hit. Her anti-aircraft guns fired everything they had, but there were too many planes, too fast, from too many directions. Torpedoes slammed into her port side in rapid succession. She began listing heavily. Counterflooding could not compensate. 3 more torpedoes jammed her auxiliary rudder hard to port. At 2:05 p.m., the order to abandon ship was given. At 2:23 p.m., Yamato rolled over and her magazines detonated. The explosion sent a pillar of fire and smoke 6 miles into the sky, visible from Kyushu. Of 3,332 crew members, 269 survived. The total losses from Operation Tengo: 3,665 Japanese sailors killed, 6 warships destroyed, including the largest battleship in history, 10 American aircraft lost. Those 4,000 tons of fuel that the Tokuyama workers had pumped out of nearly empty tanks, they were the last significant quantity of operational fuel the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever consume. After April 7th, there was nothing left. Ships that survived the war sat in Japanese harbors with bone-dry bunkers. The oil fields in Borneo were still producing. The oil sat in storage tanks with no tankers left to transport it. The empire had come full circle. It went to war to secure oil. It captured the oil fields. It restored production. And then it watched its tanker fleet disappear beneath the waves, while its warships ran dry, one by one. So let me give you the final audit. Japan needed approximately 40 million barrels of oil per year to sustain operations against the United States. Japan had access to roughly 25 million barrels after accounting for sabotage, transportation losses, and submarine warfare. A structural deficit of 15 million barrels per year that no amount of courage, tactical brilliance, or fighting spirit could overcome. The war was lost in that arithmetic. Everything else, Every battle, every sacrifice, every kamikaze attack, every suicide mission was the working out of mathematical inevitability. Admiral Yamamoto never lived to see the final collapse he predicted. On April 18, 1943, American fighters intercepted his aircraft over Bougainville. American codebreakers had decrypted his travel itinerary. The man who knew the math was wrong from the beginning died 18 months before the ultimate proof arrived. Commander Minoru Genda survived the war. He became Chief of Staff of Japan's Air Self-Defense Force from 1959 to 1962. He entered politics, serving in the House of Councillors. Throughout his life, he consistently stated that even if Pearl Harbor had been executed perfectly, even if the fuel tanks had been destroyed, even if the carriers had been caught in port, Japan still would have lost. The industrial and resource imbalance was too great. Captain Kuroshima, the brilliant eccentric who worked naked while calculating fuel consumption rates, also survived. The assumptions built into his war plans were wrong, the calculations were wrong, and the consequences were catastrophic. And Takeo Yoshikawa, the spy who spent 9 months watching Pearl Harbor, who swam through the harbor at night breathing through a hollow reed, who memorized ship movements and fuel tank locations. After the war, he fled into the Japanese countryside disguised as a Buddhist monk, terrified of arrest. He returned to his wife when the occupation ended. Japan never gave him recognition, no medal, no pension. He opened a candy store, but it failed when neighbors learned of his role in the Pearl Harbor intelligence operation. They blamed him for the war. They even blamed me for the atomic bomb, he said. His wife sold insurance to support the family. Yoshikawa spent his remaining years in obscurity and bitterness, asking one question: why has history cheated me? The answer is that history did not cheat him. Mathematics did. The intelligence was excellent. The attack he helped enable was devastating. But the war that attack started was lost before the first plane launched from Akagi's deck. Lost in the arithmetic of barrels needed versus barrels available. Lost in the assumption that a short war would stay short. Lost in the belief that captured oil fields would produce at full capacity. Lost in the failure to calculate how many tankers would never reach home. When nations ignore mathematics because the numbers contradict political goals, when institutions suppress analysis because it challenges approved strategies, when leaders choose comfortable falsehoods over uncomfortable facts. The result is Yamato sailing to her death on the last fuel an empire could scrape together. Workers climbing into empty tanks to pump out a few more drops for men they knew would never come back. That is the cost of getting the math wrong. If you found this forensic deep dive valuable, hit that like button. It helps this video reach more people who need to understand how wars are really won and lost, not by admirals and generals, but by the mathematics of logistics that everyone else ignores. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold stories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching. And remember, logistics is not just about fuel, it is about life.